The day before Thanksgiving, 1971, Portland International Airport pulsed with the usual holiday chaos. Announcements echoing across terminals, luggage wheels dragging on tile, children tugging at coats, and rushed passengers glancing nervously at the clocks overhead. Amid the noise and movement, no one noticed the man in the black suit. He wasn't tall nor short, not overly handsome nor particularly plain. He blended in, deliberately so. He wore a tailored black trench coat, dark slacks, a crisp white shirt, and a narrow black tie. A pair of black sunglasses concealed his eyes even indoors, and in his right hand he carried a small black attaché case. When he stepped up to the Northwest Orient Airlines counter, he spoke in a low, confident voice. "Seattle, one way." The agent didn't blink. He paid in cash, $20 flat, and when asked for his name, he simply said, "Dan Cooper." No identification was required. In 1971, air travel still carried the illusion of civility. That illusion was about to be shattered. Cooper boarded Flight 305 just before 2:30 p.m., a Boeing 727 scheduled for a short trip north to Seattle. The flight wasn't full, just 36 passengers and 6 crew members. He chose seat 18C near the rear of the cabin, the window seat. From there, he had a clear view of the aisle, the rear galley, and the staircase that led directly out the back of the aircraft, a feature unique to the 727. He settled in quietly, ordering a bourbon and soda before takeoff. To the flight attendants, he was calm and courteous, maybe even forgettable, but he was watching every movement, every face, every second. At exactly 2:50 p.m., the plane lifted off into the cold November sky. It was just another ordinary flight until it wasn't. Florence Schaffner, the flight attendant working the rear, approached him with a smile. She handed him a napkin and checked if he needed anything. Without a word, Cooper passed her a small, folded slip of paper. She assumed it was a phone number. It happened often. She tucked it into her pocket and turned away. But then, a quiet voice stopped her. "Miss, I think you should read that note. I have a bomb." Her hand froze. Slowly, she pulled the note back out and opened it. The words were typed in blocky mechanical letters. There were no threats, no panic, only a chilling command. "I have a bomb in my briefcase. Sit beside me." She obeyed, legs trembling, heart pounding against her ribs like a drumbeat. As she sat, Cooper turned to her, unlatched the briefcase, just enough for her to see inside. Red cylindrical sticks, bundled wires, and a battery pack. It looked like dynamite. Maybe it was. She didn't dare ask. He didn't yell. He didn't sweat. Instead, in that same calm voice, he laid out his demands. $200,000 in negotiable American currency, 4 parachutes, 2 front, 2 back, and a fuel truck waiting in Seattle to refuel the plane upon landing. No delays, no tricks. If his instructions weren't followed precisely, everyone on board would die. Florence nodded, barely breathing, and made her way to the cockpit to relay the hijacker's demands. Behind her, Cooper reclined slightly, took a sip of his bourbon, and looked out the window as if nothing had changed. The other passengers laughed, read magazines, chatted with seatmates, completely unaware that 10,000 feet above Oregon, the man in seat 18C had just seized control of Flight 305. Captain William Scott was no stranger to turbulence, mechanical failures, sudden downdrafts, even lightning strikes. But this was different. When flight attendant Florence Schaffner entered the cockpit, pale and trembling, and whispered, "He says he has a bomb," the cabin pressure seemed to shift. The hum of the engines became a distant drone. The cockpit fell silent. For a moment, Captain Scott looked at her, unsure whether she was serious. Then he turned to his co-pilot, William Rataczak, and calmly reached for the radio. "Seattle Center," he said, trying to keep his voice level. "We have a situation. We are being hijacked." Below, air traffic control snapped into action. Within minutes, the FBI's Seattle field office was alerted. Phones rang through the corridors of authority. Agents dropped their Thanksgiving plans. A man named D.B. Cooper, or so they thought, had hijacked a domestic airliner and claimed to be carrying a bomb. It wasn't just a crime. It was a first. America had never seen anything like this. In less than an hour, the tarmac at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport was flooded with unmarked cars, agents in plain clothes, and a tension that crackled like static. Somewhere above them, a man with no criminal record and no known motive had seized control of a commercial jet with nothing but a suitcase and a terrifying calm. Back on the plane, Cooper didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten the passengers. In fact, he barely acknowledged them. Florence returned to her duties, shaken but composed, trying to look natural. The passengers still didn't know. That was Cooper's instruction. No alarms, no drama. Keep everyone calm, he'd said. And strangely they were, because they didn't know their lives now hung by a thread. When asked why he wanted 4 parachutes, he gave no explanation. But the implication was chilling. If the authorities gave him a sabotaged chute, maybe he'd force someone else to jump with him. The cash was being assembled. $200,000 in used, unmarked $20 bills. Each bill was photographed, its serial number logged. A Seattle police officer, under FBI instruction, collected 4 parachutes from a nearby skydiving school. One of them was a training parachute that turned out to be sewn shut. A mistake that would cause ripples later, but at the time, it didn't matter. They had to deliver. Cooper had given them until 5 p.m. As the plane circled Seattle in a holding pattern, Cooper sat back in seat 18C, his sunglasses still on. Occasionally, he'd light another cigarette. He'd glance at his wristwatch. He ordered another bourbon. There was something about him, the way he moved, the way he didn't, that made the crew uneasy. He wasn't a desperate man. He was deliberate, thoughtful, dangerous, yes, but not chaotic. It felt like this was something he had studied, planned, rehearsed. On the ground, FBI agents stood by with rifles inside airport hangars, hidden from view. Helicopters were considered, then ruled out. A sniper shot was debated, then dismissed. No one knew how stable the bomb was. No one wanted to risk it. So they waited, eyes on the sky, ears on the radio. Up above, Cooper checked his watch one last time. The deadline was closing in. As the minutes passed, the plane's engines hummed steadily, cutting through the cold November sky. Flight 305 remained in its holding pattern above. The Puget Sound, circling at a low altitude, 10,000 feet, just as Cooper had demanded. Beneath them, the entire Seattle-Tacoma International Airport had transformed into a ghost town. Planes grounded, vehicles lined up for miles, and hundreds of officers, agents, and airport staff stood waiting, silent, apprehensive. The FBI, in their crisis mode, could do nothing but wait for Cooper to make his next move. The only certainty was that the bomb was still somewhere on board. Inside the aircraft, the crew remained in a strange limbo. They moved between tense professionalism and the shock that was beginning to creep into their bones. Cooper's calmness unsettled them. There was no shouting, no chaotic demands, just a stillness that hinted at something darker. Flight attendant Tina Mucklow noticed the way he seemed unfazed by the crisis, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, his posture straight and relaxed, as if he was simply on an ordinary flight. Captain William Scott, having received the confirmation that the ransom money and parachutes were ready, briefed his crew. At 5:00 p.m., the clock was ticking. Cooper's deadline was closing in. The FBI's instructions were clear. Do not engage. No one was to make any sudden moves. The plane was to land in Seattle, drop off the hostages, exchange the money and parachutes, and take off again. The plan was simple, but everyone knew that simple plans often unraveled the moment you tried to execute them. As the plane descended towards Seattle-Tacoma, Cooper leaned back in his seat, eyes never leaving the horizon. A distant sound of a helicopter. Circling grew louder for a moment before fading again. He wasn't concerned about it. Nothing seemed to break his concentration. Florence approached him again, her voice steady but her hands trembling as she passed him the updated information. The money was on board, the fuel truck was ready, and the parachutes had been delivered. He gave her a nod, but no words came from his lips. He simply lit another cigarette, took a long drag, and returned his gaze to the window. At 5:20 p.m., Flight 305 touched down on the tarmac. The passengers were still unaware, blissfully oblivious to the high-stakes drama unfolding above them. The aircraft slowed, and as it came to a stop, Cooper gave his orders. The passengers were to disembark, but not before the exchange had been. made, the doors opened, and the 36 passengers were allowed to leave. Some walked calmly down the aisle, others were confused, their gazes darting around, unsure of what was happening. The flight attendants kept their composure as they walked the passengers to safety. It wasn't until the last passenger disembarked that Cooper's negotiation was set in motion. With the hostages safely on the ground, Cooper sat, unbothered, waiting. His eyes remained fixed on the cockpit as the flight crew exchanged a quick glance. The tension was palpable, but Cooper remained still. His presence was an unnerving calm. He was the eye of the storm, and soon the real test would begin. The key. Crew had no way of knowing what was to come next, or what Cooper had planned, but something told them the worst was still to come. Each moment that passed felt like a countdown, the seconds ticking away as the clock drew nearer to 7 p.m. Tina Mucklow, the head flight attendant, returned to Cooper's seat, the one in 18C, where he sat as still as ever. There was no sign of urgency, no sign of fear. The man who had hijacked this plane with nothing more than a briefcase and a cold, unwavering gaze was about to get what he wanted. The FBI had arranged the $200,000 in cash and the 4 parachutes, just as he had ordered. The authorities had followed every instruction to the letter, but there was still a feeling in the air, an unease that even the calmest demeanor couldn't dispel. Tina walked down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the silent cabin, and stood in front of Cooper. His eyes, hidden behind dark glasses, never left her face. "Everything is ready," she said, trying to steady her voice. Her hand still trembled slightly. "The money's on the plane. The parachutes are in the rear compartment, the fuel. Truck is waiting for us in Seattle." Cooper nodded slowly, not reacting with the joy or relief that one might expect. His face remained inscrutable, his posture still relaxed. "Good," he said simply. There was something unnerving in the simplicity of his words, in how they lacked emotion. Cooper wasn't celebrating his victory. He was merely executing a plan that he had been in control of from the start. He leaned forward then, as if finally deciding to engage. "You'll fly me south to Mexico City, no tricks. Low altitude, slow speed. I don't want anyone getting any funny ideas." Tina nodded and stepped back slightly, still maintaining her professional composure, but her mind raced. She was part of something much bigger now, something that no one would ever fully understand. Meanwhile, Captain Scott and his crew were preparing for takeoff. The flight attendants exchanged tense glances, their thoughts consumed with the same unspoken question. What would happen when they left Seattle's airspace? What was Cooper's true plan? They were flying him to Mexico City, but that didn't mean he planned to stay on the plane. The FBI had expected him to try to make an escape. But how? What would happen once they reached cruising altitude? Cooper had made it clear. He wanted to be alone. He insisted that no one was to join him in the cockpit, no one to disturb his solitude as the plane took off again. The flight crew complied. They didn't have a choice. Outside, the tension mounted with every minute that passed. Helicopters hovered in the distance, their rotors slicing through the air, but Cooper was far beyond the reach of those above. The fuel truck waited just beyond the perimeter of the runway, ready for the next phase of the plan. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with uncertainty. Cooper's presence had commanded attention, but the crew was still in the dark about what he truly intended. Captain William Scott, his knuckles white on the controls, kept his eyes focused ahead. He was flying under orders, but the weight of those orders seemed heavier now. The crew had no idea what awaited them once they reached cruising altitude. They had no idea if they would survive this encounter. Cooper sat calmly in seat 18C, still wearing his dark sunglasses, his posture unshaken. He had given precise instructions. They were to fly at 10,000 feet, at a slow speed of 170 knots. No higher, no faster. The low altitude was a strange request for a hijacker, but the calmness with which Cooper made the demand only added to the unease. Captain Scott kept the plane steady, his focus unwavering, but even he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling at the back of his mind, the feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. Meanwhile, Tina Mucklow, the head flight attendant, stood near the galley, her heart still racing from the earlier exchange. exchange. She glanced back toward the rear stairs, knowing what was about to happen. Cooper had insisted that the staircase be left extended during the flight, a request that seemed odd to everyone but one person, him. The rear stairs, normally used only for emergencies, were now his escape route. For a moment, time seemed to stretch. The plane flew on, cutting through the night sky, and the crew could feel the tension growing tighter with each passing second. And as the plane soared through the sky, the crew had no idea that this would be the moment when Cooper would vanish. The seconds ticked by slowly, and the moment arrived. Cooper stood up from his seat and walked to the rear of the plane, passing the aisle with deliberate steps. He moved with the confidence of someone who had done this before, as if the flight attendants and crew were nothing more than players in a game he had already won. The rear stairwell door opened. No one knew exactly what he was doing, but the moment the door slid open, there would be no turning back. Outside, the cold, dark sky stretched endlessly, the perfect backdrop for a man about to disappear without a trace. As Cooper walked toward the rear of the plane, the crew had no idea that the final act was about to begin. The low hum of the engines and the gentle rocking of the plane provided a strange sense of calm, almost as if the airliner were floating through time itself, oblivious to the impending chaos. The flight attendants exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke. They had followed every instruction to the letter. They had delivered the ransom, handed over the parachutes, and now they could only watch. Cooper reached the back of the plane and, without hesitation, opened the rear stairway door. The cold air rushed in, howling like a living thing, and for a moment, the plane seemed to shudder. His silhouette, barely visible against the darkness of the night, stood framed by the opening. The crew couldn't see him clearly, but they felt the weight of the moment. The door was open, and that was all they needed to know. Tina Mucklow, still standing near the galley, could hear the wind grow louder. She turned just in time to see Cooper's figure fade into the dark, vanishing into the abyss of the night sky. There was no scream, no shout of defiance, just silence. He was gone. In the cockpit, Captain Scott's voice cracked through the radio. "What's going on back there?" His voice was sharp, laced with panic, but the response came too late. By the time the crew had processed what had happened, Cooper was already out of sight, descending into the night at 170 knots, no one sure exactly where he had landed. Outside, the night sky stretched endlessly, pitch black with only a few dim stars visible through the cloud cover. Mount St. Helens and the dense forests of southwestern Washington lay beneath them, the perfect landscape for a man determined to vanish without a trace. The plane continued its flight path for a few more miles, but the crew knew now that Cooper was no longer on board. Their passenger, their hijacker, had just jumped into the cold, unforgiving night, and the flight crew, like everyone else, had no idea if they would ever see him again. As the plane continued on to Reno, its mission essentially over, the FBI scrambled to organize a search. They assumed that Cooper had parachuted into one of the dense forests, where his survival was a slim possibility. The next few hours were filled with reports of search planes and helicopters scouring the area below, but the search turned up nothing. No body, no parachute, no sign of the man who had just pulled off one of the most daring escapes in modern history. The authorities were baffled. In a world that was still coming to terms with the threat of hijackings, Cooper had vanished without a trace. The ransom money, carried by the wind and rain, would be the next clue. But in that moment, there was nothing. No body, no explanation. The man in the black suit, who had walked calmly into the terminal that morning, was now gone, a phantom in the night. In the hours following Cooper's daring escape, the FBI launched what would become the largest manhunt in U.S. history. They scoured the forests of southwestern Washington, where Cooper had parachuted into the night. They sent helicopters, search teams, and dogs into the dense woods, hoping to find some trace of him, a dropped parachute, a footprint, even the faintest shred of evidence. The planes continued to circle, their searchlights sweeping across the ground, but no one found anything. The days turned into weeks, then months. The manhunt continued, but it was increasingly clear that Cooper had vanished. The forest was vast, and the weather had turned against them. The rain and wind had erased any signs of his landing, and the FBI's initial excitement began to fade into frustration. Cooper had simply disappeared, and there was no trail to follow. One of the few pieces of evidence the FBI had was the ransom money. In 1980, nearly a decade after the hijacking, a young boy playing on the banks of the Columbia River found a stack of bills, $5,800 of the ransom money, the exact denomination and serial numbers of the bills handed over to Cooper. The discovery was a shocking twist, but it only deepened the mystery. If Cooper had jumped into the forest and survived, why was the money buried in the river? Had he not made it out alive? Or had he simply hidden the cash, perhaps intending to return for it later? This discovery would become one of the few tangible pieces of evidence in a case full of questions, but it would also spark a wave of new theories. Some believed that Cooper had died in the jump, his body lost in the wilderness, never to be found. Others argued that he had successfully escaped, possibly with the help of local accomplices, and was living under a new identity. Still, there was the possibility that he had been killed during the jump or during the search, his body lost to the rugged terrain. The FBI would spend years investigating every lead, following up on tips and conducting interviews. They even investigated Richard McCoy, a man who had committed a similar hijacking just months after Cooper's. But there was no hard evidence linking him to the crime. McCoy was eventually caught, and while his crime had eerie similarities, the FBI ruled him out as Cooper. The search grew cold. With every passing year, the mystery of D.B. Cooper seemed to slip further into the realm of legend. Documentaries and books were written about him. Theories and conspiracies flourished in the media, with armchair detectives offering their own explanations for Cooper's fate. Some believed he was a military-trained skydiver. Others thought he was a disgruntled airman with intimate knowledge of commercial aviation. And still others argued that Cooper had been nothing more than a simple man who saw an opportunity and seized it. But as the years turned into decades, the case went cold. No new evidence was found, no new suspects emerged, and the man who had once held the world in suspense had become a figure of myth and legend. To this day, D.B. Cooper remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history, a man who vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and an empty parachute. As the years passed, the mystery of D.B. Cooper didn't fade. If anything, it only grew stronger. His name became synonymous with the impossible, with the idea of a man who pulled off the greatest heist in modern history and simply disappeared. The case was closed by the FBI in 2016, but for those who had lived through it, and for the countless who had studied the details, it was far from over. By 2020, a documentary aired titled The Mystery of D.B. Cooper, revisiting the entire case and interviewing those involved, from the FBI agents who worked tirelessly on the investigation to the flight crew who lived through the terrifying ordeal. The film was a new chapter in the story, one that offered no closure, only more questions.